Now, in the last lesson, we saw the most basic type of JavaScript functions. And that is a way of allowing us to package a number of instructions into a block of code, which we can execute at once by using the name of the function. Now, if any of that was confusing, then I recommend reviewing the last lesson and playing around with the basic function yourself, either in the Chrome Developer Tools or through using Carol the robot, and just making sure that you fully understand what's going on before you proceed. Now, when I was little, my parents used to love buying these Neapolitan ice creams, which come in 3 flavors, right? Vanilla, strawberry, and chocolate. And I always thought it was really indecisive of them, instead of just picking your favorite flavor, right? But just like ice cream comes in 3 classic flavors, functions also come in 3 classic flavors. And what we saw just now was the vanilla version, the simplest form of the JavaScript function. So let's take a look at the next flavor of functions. And going back to our little house robot scenario, now what if I had the ability to not only say get milk, which executes all of the commands inside the get milk function, but what if I could say get milk, and inside the parentheses, I specify the number of bottles of milk that I want the robot to get? Well, in order to do this, we have to modify our simple function a little bit. And we have to allow it to accept inputs, whereas previously we had nothing between the parentheses because that function didn't take any inputs. In this case, we're putting in the name of the input that is going to go into this function and allows it to be used inside the series of instructions. So in this case, when we call get milk, it's still going to execute all of these alerts to the robot to command it to do something. But in the middle, when we get to the buy milk section, it's going to tell it to buy a specific number of bottles of milk based on the input that the function gets when it gets called. So when we create the function, we're still using the function keyword. We're still giving it the same name called get milk. But in this case, in between the parentheses, we've got the name of the input. And in this case, it's called bottles. Now, that bottles is used much like a variable to contain the input. And we can now use it inside the function to calculate something or to do something with it. In this case, we're calculating the cost. Say if 1 bottle of milk costs $1.5, then depending on the number of bottles of milk the master wanted, then we would have to calculate the amount of money we have to give to the shopkeeper, right? Now, when you call this function, it's similar to what we did previously, but this time, instead of having empty parentheses, we're giving the input of 2. And this will get bound to that name bottles inside the function. So if we call this function using get milk parentheses 2, then 2 goes into bottles. So now we have a variable called bottles that's equal to 2, and then we can calculate cost, which equals to 2 times 1.5, which equals 3. So the cost is $3. And this is the second flavor of functions, which is kind of like the chocolate flavor, right? A little bit better than vanilla. And now when we say get milk 2, our robot knows how many bottles of milk to get. It will also be able to use that number of bottles to calculate how much money it needs to spend at the store and how much change it should get back for its master. So we can use the input inside the block of code. So if we take a look at this inside our Chrome Developer Tools, if we modify our get milk function to take an input, say called bottles, now we're able to use this variable bottles inside the curly braces of this function. So for example, instead of simply console logging buy milk, I can now use that variable bottles inside my code. So now I want the console log to read buy the number of bottles plus the string bottles of milk. So now when we call this function, we have to specify an input. So let's say buy 12, right? So let's put 12 in here. Now, once I hit run, you'll see that bottles now takes on the value of 12 and it gets placed inside this console log statement. So now if I hit Command K or Control K on Windows to clear the console and I run the code inside my snippets, then you'll see that in addition to carrying out all the other commands, it also says buy 12 bottles of milk, and that 12 comes from the input that I used to call this function getMilk. Now, this is a really neat way of modifying your function so that it does more than simply repeating a bunch of code that you've packaged together. So as a challenge, I want you to change this code here to take money instead of bottles, and I want you to use it to calculate the number of bottles the robot is able to buy. So, for example, if you gave your robot $10 and a bottle of milk costs $1.5, you should be able to modify your function to calculate how many bottles of milk the robot is able to buy based on the amount of money that you gave the robot. So you should be able to say something like getMilk, maybe $5, and if one bottle of milk is, say, $1.5, then that should mean that your robot should be able to buy 5 divided by 1.5, which equals 3.33. So it won't be able to buy a 0.3 bottle. Nobody's going to let it slash a bottle of milk into a third, but it will be able to buy 3 bottles of milk back. So see if you can modify this function in order to take an amount of money as an input and be able to change the console log to state how many bottles of milk it's going to buy based on how much money it got. So if you haven't followed the function up till now, you can download this code here in the resources section of this lesson, and you can use it to complete the challenge. So pause the video now and give it a go. All right, so this time, instead of taking bottles as an input, we're going to take money as the input. And this is just a name that we're going to assign to whatever number comes in through here. So we're going to keep this function call the same. So we're calling the function getMilk, giving the input a value of 5. Now 5 gets bound to this word money, and we can now use it inside the function. So for example, we can say something like var number of bottles equals money divided by 1.5, which we said in this scenario is the cost per bottle of milk. And then we're going to say console.log by number of bottles of milk. But right now, if we clean the console and run our code, you'll see that we're getting 3.3 recurring bottles of milk, which is not what we want, right? We want it to only say 3. So how can we get it to do that? Well, this might have required a little bit of Googling, but essentially what we're trying to do is how do we round down JavaScript? So we can see that the first link that we get is from the W3 Schools, and you can see that it's pointing us towards something called the JavaScript floor method, where you can write math.floor, and inside the parentheses, we put the number that we want to round down. So let's give this a go over here. What if we said number of bottles equals math.floor, and then inside these round parentheses, we put in the number that we want to round down. Now, it's important that we're rounding down because even if it was 4.99 bottles, we still can't buy 0.99 bottles of milk, right? So we have to round it down. So now if we run our code with this floor function here, then you can see that our code now tells the robot to buy 3 bottles of milk, which is exactly what we wanted. So very often when you're trying to do something with code, anything that you're trying to achieve is usually just a quick Google away. So I hope that challenge was interesting. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at an even more complex form of functions, which is functions that can give an output back in addition to taking an input. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.